Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's talk. And today we will start to discuss Thomas Hobbes, which will be the first contract theorist we will address in this class. Where, in some regards, you can see Machiavelli as a great in-between writer between the classics and modernity, with Hobbes, we really will enter the era of modernity. Like the founders of the scientific revolution had done with natural philosophy and got away with Aristotelian's dominance there, Hobbes wanted to achieve the same aim in the political sphere or in the political sciences. So what Hobbes set himself to do was to create a understanding of the political that was devoid of the Aristotelian concept. And Hobbes himself called this a civic science. In this, he was influenced by many people like Descartes, Harvey, Galileo, whom he met, and Francis Bacon, from whom he actually briefly worked. In chapter 46 of the Leviathan, which goes by the great name of Darkness from Vain Philosophies and Fabulous Traditions, he then also writes in section 11, "And I believe that scarce anything can be more absurdly said in the natural philosophy than that which is now called the Aristotelian metaphysics, nor more repugnant to government than much that he has said in his politics, no more ignorantly than a great part of his ethics." To break with the previously dominant Aristotelian paradigm is clear and definite. From this, we will now move to the introduction of the Leviathan, and it becomes evident that Hobbes' new way of theorizing heavily relies on this new scientific idea. So, as you will find in the introduction, we'll take an important quote from it and then, like Machiavelli, try to understand it at the end of this talk. The quote goes as follows: "Art goes yet further, imitating that rational and most excellent work of nature, man. For by art is created a great Leviathan, called a commonwealth or state, in Latin civitas, which is but an artificial man, though a great stature and strength than the natural one, for whose protection and defense it was intended, and which the sovereign is an artificial soul, as giving life and motion to the whole body. Magistrates and other officers of judicature and execution, artificial joints, rewards and punishment are the nerves that do the same body natural. The wealth and riches of all particular members are the strength, salus populi, people's safety, is its business. Counselors are the memory, equity and law, an artificial reason and will. Conduct, its health, sedition, sickness, and civil war, death. Lastly, the pacts and covenants, by which the parts of this body politic were first made, set together and unite, and resemble that fiat, or let us make a man, as pronounced by God in the creation." Art rises above nature, the state being artificial rather than natural, as in Aristotle. If the state is a body of organism, it is to be an artificial one driven by motion that seems to follow some law-like behavior, normally found in scientific laws. Not only is the quote illustrative of Hobbes' approach, we will also make this quote guiding throughout our discussion. So, let's start with, if you like to call it that way, Hobbes' political physics. When Hobbes in the introduction rhetorically states, "What is a heart but a spring, and nerves but so many strings, and joints but so many wheels, by giving motion to the whole body, such as intended by the artificer," he not only gives a material interpretation of the human body reduced to its movable components, like in a machine, but also a profoundly anti-theological account of human nature, which was Aristotle's understanding. But what are these movable components that the human body is made of? Well, as we can see in chapter 6, there be in man two sorts of motions, peculiar to them. One called vital, began in generation and continues without interruption through one's whole life. The other is animal motion, otherwise called voluntary motion, as first manifested in our minds, which depends always upon a precedented thought. It is this latter motion that we will focus on when studying politics. These voluntary motions for Hobbes are directed towards felicity, or as he says it is, a continual success in obtaining those things which man from time to time desires, that is continual and prospering. And this is where our trouble starts. From this continuous pursuit of felicity, we will from time to time come to desire similar objects as other men. Add to this that we are all more or less equal in strength and intellectual capacity, the result is an equal hope in attaining the desired object, ends, leading to quarrel fighting and eventually war. In the state of nature, that is, in absence of an authority, we should put a brake on our natural passions and inclinations. Our pursuit of felicity will lead to a state of war of every man against every man if we won't. Or as Hobbes likes to call it in chapter 13, the pursuit of felicity will lead to continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. There are some comments to be made here. First of all, the state of nature is not a constant state of quarrel or actual fighting. More importantly is this element of continual fear and danger of violent death. This fear makes the state of nature endurable or inhabitable and prevents industry. This state of nature does not have to be read as historically accurate, but can also be derived from his, as we just did, political physics. In this regard, it is a thought experiment in which the abstract individuals are placed and trying to find out how those elements would behave in this regard as akin to a scientific experiment. Yet, this interpretation of what's happening in the state of nature is not completely accurate, or does not give us the full picture of what Hobbes meant when he was writing this. We can get the full picture, or maybe the more trustworthy interpretation, when discussing Hobbes in the light of a conception of morality, which for him would be best characterized by individualism. For this, it is important to note that voluntary actions are at the core of our troublesome predicament, and manifests first in the mind and are therefore preceded by thought. Acting in this way is therefore a conscious exercise of willing, of moving towards what the eye considers likable and moving away from what the eye adverts to. So we call something good because we like it. We don't like it because it's good. Felicity here becomes a pursuit of what the individual considers good, and this is the cause of competition and conflict. This individualistic interpretation of Hobbes can be underwritten by his skepticism, which for Hobbes means that there can be no transparent or non-human foundations for our belief. So knowledge is a human construct and can be shaped to what humans can be moved to agree upon. The implications of this skepticism is that in the state of nature, there are no, so to say, natural standards by which to adjudicate conflict. In this sense, it becomes clear why Hobbes claims in chapter 13, to this war of every man against every man, this is also consequent, that nothing can be unjust, the notions of right and wrong, justice and injustice have no place. Where there is no common power, there is no law. Where there is no law, no justice. Force and fraud are in war two cardinal virtues. Justice and injustice are none of the faculties neither of the body or mind. They are qualities that relate to men in our society, not in solitude. It is inconsequent also to the same condition that there be no property, no dominion, no mine and thine distinct, but only that to be every man's that he can get, and for so long as he can keep it. The problem that is occurrent in the state of nature is thus the unregulated state of affairs, which makes up for a state of maximal insecurity. It is this that turns us into a state of war of every man against every man, rather than actual continuous fighting. Hobbes rhetorically supports this point, and I think it's just too beautiful to leave it unmentioned. So, to the people who believe in his skepticism, he asks them a question to ponder upon themselves and see whether they come to the same conclusion as Hobbes did. Let him therefore consider with himself, when taking a journey, he arms himself and seeks to go well accompanied. When going to sleep, he locks his doors. When even in his house, he locks his chest, and this when he knows there to be laws and public officers, armed to revenge all injuries shall be done to him. What opinion does he have of his fellow subject when he rides armed, of his fellow citizen when he locks his door, and of his children and servants when he locks his chest? Does he dare as much accuse mankind by his actions as I do by my word? Thus, we can state that the conflict and war are primary and peace itself is derivative. Yet what is this peace then derivative of? How can we get out of a situation where life is short, poor, brutish, and nasty? The answer is in one of our passions, but not the passion that causes men to desire and seek out conflict. It's rather the other one, in a aversion. He writes in chapter 13, the passion that inclines men to peace are fear of death. And luckily for us, reason suggests convenient articles of peace upon which man may draw an agreement. These articles are they which are otherwise called laws of nature. It is pride that needs to be tamed by the Leviathan. And as we find in the book of Job, so it's a biblical reference, Leviathan actually means the king of children of pride. And the fear of death is the passion which will provide our basis for doing so. A law of nature, Hobbes writes, is a precept or general rule found by reason by which man is forbidden to do that which is destructive of his life, or take away the means of preserving the same, and omit that by which he thinks it may be best preserved. It is this fear that leads us to reason, that leads us to the law of natures. The first law of nature then becomes to seek peace and follow it. Not only do these laws constitute rules, they also imply obligations to lie down arms and strive towards this peace-seeking. The second law of nature then unsurprisingly states that a man be willing, when others are so too, as for peace and defense of himself, he shall think it necessary to lay down his right to all things, and to be content with so much liberty against other men as he would allow other men to have against himself. Shortly said, Hobbes' 19 laws of nature can be seen as a roadmap to civil society, and contain as a duty Hobbes' negative formulation of the golden rule. Do not do to others what you would not have done unto you. But these moral laws pose a problem to us. What is the status of these natural laws? Are they to be interpreted along the lines of this political physics, as we mentioned earlier, as the laws, as the behavior outlined there follows a sort of necessitated line, or should we understand them as moral laws, as a precepts of reason, meaning that these laws are not just descriptive, but also prescriptive? You ought not to do anything that is destructive of life. But that means that we can obey or disobey them. for prescriptive laws need to have an element of choice or will in it. On this he writes in section 41, a part of the book that's left out in your copy. These dictates of reason men used to call by the names of laws, but improperly, for they are but conclusions of theorems concerning what conduces to the conservation and defense of themselves. So they are rules of practical reason. They are not categorical, but hypothetical commands, if you want to put it into Kantian terms. And according to Hobbes, these 19 laws of nature are the true and only moral philosophy. But given that we are in a state of nature and this condition of skepticism, how can all of this become achieved? How can one lay down his right to anything? The only way to do this, Hobbes claims, is to divest oneself from the liberty he has in a state of nature. And this is where contracts start to enter the equation. To effectively lay down a right, it has to be transferred. By transferring, when he intends the benefit thereof, to some certain person or persons, and when a man has in either manner abandoned or granted away his right, then he is said to be obliged or bound, not to hinder those to whom such is granted, or abandoned from the benefit of it, and that he ought, and it is his duty, not to make void that voluntary act of his own, and such hindrance is injustice and injury, as being sin jure, the right being before renouncing or transferred, so that injury or injustice in the controversies of the world is somewhat like that which is in the disputation of scholars called absurdity. There are three things to note about this passage. First, the notion of justice and obligation here arises out of committing yourself to something. A break of this commitment is considered illogical, or what in the disputation of scholars is called an absurdity. The problem here is that the later act contradicts the intentions that were at the basis of transferring the right. This puts some constraints on what kind of rights we can transfer, as the basis of this rational enterprise was a fear of death. So we cannot sell ourselves into slavery or harm, for instance. This would contradict the intention that came before. Secondly, since such transfer must be a voluntary act, and all voluntary acts, as said in the beginning, must arise out of passions, there must be some benefit to the person committing the act, either by obtaining something he desires or moving away from something he averses. Thirdly, these obligations do not get their binding force from just making the agreement, but from the punishment one is subjected to when committing the specific injustice. So the binding force is in the punishment that you may be subjected to the moment that you commit an injustice. Putting this together, one cannot transfer his right to life, as fear of death is the motivation underlying making any such transfer. Second, most transfers will be reciprocal, as a reciprocal transfer of rights is what Hobbes calls a covenant or contract. And irrational contracts are said to be void from the beginning. In the light of the third condition, there are some contracts that can be considered void in the state of nature from the beginning, which would not be so in a civil society, as in the state of nature there might not be sufficient trust amongst the members to keep up their ends of the bargain, and in absence of a common authority, there is no one that will guarantee that everyone will indeed keep up his end. However, this third point becomes slightly more complex, because as we see in chapter 14, Hobbes states, the cause of fear, which makes such a covenant invalid, must always be something arising after the covenant is made, as some new fact or other sign of the will not to perform. else it cannot make the covenant void, for which could not hinder a promise, ought not to admit as a hindrance of performing. So the cause of fear must be a new one occurring after one engages into the agreement. Meaning for Hobbes, basically, that contracts or agreements made at gunpoint are to be considered valid. So, in the light of this, it might be instructive to look at two different examples. The first one is actually this contract at gunpoint, of which you'll find a description in chapter 14. Consider yourself to be walking down the street at night, and a ruffian shows up, points a gun at you, and says, "Your money or your life." The prudent thing to do here, of course, is to give him your wallet. But now let's imagine that in this scenario, you're not actually carrying your wallet. And you come to some kind of agreement with the ruffian that you can go home and pick up your money. Now, done deal, you go home, collect your money. Yet at some point, you find yourself wondering, should I actually do this? Should I actually go back to the ruffian and give him the money? Am I bound or obliged to do so? Well, let's go back to these three criteria as we considered earlier. First of all, are you laying down your right to life? So, in a state of nature, you may always counteract force by force. This is definitely an option in the case which we're describing, but not a very prudent one, as the other person has a gun and you do not. So reason here seems to dictate seeking peace. That is the most prudent thing to do. Is the transfer in question, which was our second condition, reciprocal? Yes, you get your life, which I think you'll value quite highly, and the ruffian gets his money. Thirdly, did an additional fear arise after the fact? If not, then we must come to the conclusion that the agreement was binding. Well, no change has been made to the situation. You, of course, have the opportunity to fall back into an injustice in a state of war of every man, but that would probably result in ending your life considering the position of power here. So, there's not enough reason to consider an additional threat to your life afterwards, meaning that all three conditions, as we've derived from the previous passage about what makes an obligation binding, have been met. So yes, you need to go out of the safety and comfort of your home and give your money to the ruffian. Let's now consider another case, where you and this ruffian actually decide to ambush a third party and then decide to share the spoils. Is such a covenant or agreement binding in a state of nature? Well, no. Why is this not the case? Both of you have shown to each other by offering to make an agreement, that includes robbing someone, that you're willing to go quite far in your extension of force. So from the beginning, there is a guarantee that's guaranteed that both of you are willing to go this far. Which means that there's no reason to assume that either one of you will keep up your end of the bargain and not just backstab the other person and use force against them or employ force against them in order to not just rob this third party, but also rob your companion. So there's no reason to assume that your partner in crime will kill you over your share of the spoils. Therefore, in this scenario, the fear of death makes a contract void from the beginning, and one cannot enter into it and expect it to be binding. Thus far, we've established which contracts are void and valid, and that obligations are only binding when they follow from valid contracts. And hence, that this is where our conception of justice lies, or where justice begins. The problem in the state of nature, however, is that most covenants will be of the order of the second case, and there will not be a place for justice, as long as no common authority is erected to guarantee the performance of contracts, by effectively punishing any break or breach of it. The only way to erect such common power, then, is when everyone confers all their power and strength upon one person or assembly, so that this plurality of wills becomes one. This creates the commonwealth in which peace becomes guaranteed, because the threat and fear arising out of men having the same hopes of obtaining a similar object can now be regulated. This one person, the Leviathan, can tame and regulate the passion of pride, being at the core of our problems in the state of nature. This one person is a moral God who carries the sovereignty. This one person is the king of children of pride. This one person is the Leviathan. Hobbes, as we know, is a defender of a form of absolute monarchy. Yet, as long as the power invested in the sovereign is not divided, he thinks that this Leviathan can take the form of either a person or an assembly of men. But in chapter 19 of the book, you will find some practical reasons for preferring a one-man government, so a monarchy, over an assembly. So let us pause and recap here. Authority and relations of authority are necessary to get us out of the state of nature, but are not themselves natural, but a product of art, a product of reason. Politics here is not, as for Aristotle, a prudential decision of fulfilling one's philos, but rather an existential decision of preferring safety in a community over the fear of death outside of it. This authority is sovereign power, which should be indivisible, and we call it a Leviathan. There are some connotations, however, to this conception of sovereignty. Also, most importantly, Hobbes informs a lot of our current day thinking about what sovereignty is. And one of these most modern examples of Hobbes' conception of a Leviathan or of sovereignty would actually be the CEO of a big company. So the first thing which we should note here about his conception of sovereignty is that it's actually a representative position. The Leviathan acts on behalf of everyone who has transferred their strengths and powers upon him to the end of assuring peace. Secondly, as justice is holding up your end of the bargain, and you transferred all of your powers to the Leviathan, every law the Leviathan makes is just, unless he poses a threat to your existence, because that's the only thing you haven't transferred to him. Hobbes cynically illustrates this point by telling the biblical story of David and Uriah. King David desires Uriah's wife Bathsheba, and David, who has actually impregnated Uriah's wife, orders Uriah to go to war and fight in the front lines, which got him killed. On this, Hobbes comments that even though David had sinned against God, he had not committed an injustice towards Bathsheba. The idea is that justice is the law, and the law is whatever the product of the institute that creates the law is. Nowadays, this view or doctrine on law is known as legal positivism. However, Hobbes does make a distinction later on in the book between better and worse laws. So even though all laws are just, dependent on their degree of commitment towards the common good, they can be considered better or worse than other laws. The idea that all laws that the sovereign makes are just is not just a funny outcome of Hobbes' lines of reasoning or from his starting position. It means that all laws are binding, and breaking them is an injustice. This means that for Hobbes, there is no justifiable ground for rebellion or a switch of the elected form of government, unless the sovereign is actively trying to take your life. Hobbes thus puts public order on a very high value. This gives us an idea about what exactly Hobbes finds so repugnant about Aristotle's politics. As he writes on this, there be other names of government than monarchy, democracy, and aristocracy in the theories and books of policy, as tyranny, oligarchy, but they are not the names of other forms of government, but are just of some forms disliked. For they are discontent under monarchy, they call it tyranny. And they are displeased with aristocracy, call it an oligarchy. So also, they which find themselves grieved under a democracy, call it anarchy. The idea here is that what the ancients teach us is to call a government corrupt before killing your sovereign makes it all right. Hobbes disagrees with this. So now let us get back to the quote that we started our exposition of the Leviathan with. For by art is created that great Leviathan, called a commonwealth or state, in Latin civitas, which is but an artificial man, though of greater stature and strength than the natural, for whose protection and defense it was intended. So we now know that art here does not mean, as in Aristotle, an imitation of nature, but something that is created. And when applied to the political, what is created becomes this political office. The office and representation is a product of human reasoning. In this way, the Leviathan is artificial, in opposition to a natural kind of authority. The greater strength than the natural is that the Leviathan has the power to moderate our passion of pride, which no person is able to do in absence of it, so in a state of nature, and which is the main reason for the state of every man, for the state of war of every man against every man in this state of nature. The end of the commonwealth is the protection of life, as the reason itself was grounded upon fear of death. Hobbes thus tells us to abstain from politics and ruling ourselves, which creates the problems in the state of nature, and that rather we should subject ourselves to the rule of an office to preserve our lives. Yet, do we find this account convincing? Or did we just create the biggest, baddest bully of them all? In order to validate this claim, the short reader on Justice and Rights by Dworkin comes in handy. In this reader, Dworkin lays out some of the problems with contract thinking. Dworkin's argument can be summarized by the idea that which holds a priori does not always hold a posteriori. He claims that the hypothetical contract does not supply an independent reason for enforcing the terms of that hypothetical contract. The idea that someone would hypothetically have agreed, Dworkin claims, stems from the underlying intuition of the agreement, for instance, prudence or fairness. But it does not provide an independent reason for enforcing it, as it would have been in the case that somebody actually has said, okay, let's run with this. Dworkin says this hypothetical contract, so the idea that you would have agreed, only serves as a heuristic device to show the appeal of the conceptions employed within the hypothetical agreement. This is his first critique against hypothetical contracts as employed by Hobbes. Now, imagine that Hobbes will respond to Dworkin's claim by saying it would be in Dworkin's interest to live under the Leviathan. Would this give an independent reason for enforcing the hypothetical contract? Here, Dworkin starts by making a distinction between an antecedent and actual interest. An antecedent interest means that given all odds and all things considered, performing an act is the bad choice. Before a race, you will want to bet on the fastest horse. That would be in your interest, your antecedent interest. Yet your actual interest, which is the thing you would be really wanting to achieve, is just to bet on the horse that wins. Because that's how you win money. So the interest Hobbes appeals to is an antecedent interest, not an actual one. And what we should note about this is that decisions based on antecedent interest are circumstance dependent. This raises the question whether Hobbes, with his bleak state of nature, did not just smuggle in what he wanted to get out at the end, which is a Leviathan. The uncertainties in the Hobbesian state of nature might make it in my antecedent interest, the best bet in that situation, different from my actual interest, which is what I really want. What do you think of this critique? Is Dworkin's smart little argument enough to argue against Hobbes' employment of the hypothetical social contract? I'm curious to hear your opinions, and we're going to leave it at that for today. So enjoy the rest of your day, and see you next time to talk about our second contract theorist, John Locke.